As the war moved forward, restraint disappeared. What had once been limited engagements between armies became something far more consuming. This was no longer just a contest of soldiers. It was a struggle between entire societies. The Civil War entered a phase where the goal was not simply to defeat the enemy on the battlefield, but to destroy their ability to continue living as before. This was the birth of total war in America. Commanders began to understand that breaking morale was as important as winning battles. Railroads, farms, factories, and towns were no longer neutral. Everything that sustained the enemy became a legitimate target. The war expanded outward, swallowing civilians, infrastructure, and daily life. One campaign symbolized this transformation more than any other. Entire regions were systematically stripped of resources. Rail lines were torn apart. Crops were burned. Livestock was seized or destroyed. Homes were left standing but emptied of everything that could support resistance. The message was unmistakable. Survival itself was now part of the battlefield. For civilians, the psychological impact was devastating. Many had believed the war would pass around them, touching only distant front lines. Instead, it arrived at their doors. Fear replaced routine. Hunger replaced stability. Communities that had existed for generations were reduced to silence and ash. Soldiers carrying out these operations often struggled internally. Some justified it as necessary. Others were deeply disturbed by what they were ordered to do. But the logic of the war left little room for hesitation. The objective was no longer honor. It was exhaustion. As the pressure increased, the cracks began to show. Armies were worn down physically and mentally. Supply shortages became constant. Desertion increased. Units that once marched proudly now moved slowly, weighed down by fatigue and loss. Leadership on both sides faced impossible choices. Accept massive casualties or risk losing momentum. Push forward or watch the enemy recover. Decisions were made that sacrificed thousands of lives for strategic advantage measured in miles. The scale of death reached unprecedented levels. Battles produced casualty numbers that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. Fields became mass graves. Towns became hospitals. The distinction between frontline and home front dissolved completely. Yet even as destruction peaked, the end was beginning to take shape. The ability to replace losses became the deciding factor. One side could draw from a vast industrial base, extensive rail networks, and a growing population. The other relied increasingly on endurance alone. But endurance has limits. By the final year, the outcome was no longer a mystery to those closest to the war. What remained uncertain was how much more suffering would be required before it ended. Fighting continued not because victory was unclear, but because surrender carried its own fear and consequences. As the conflict wound down, scenes of devastation stretched across the land. Burned cities, empty farms, railroads twisted into useless metal. The physical damage was immense, but the deeper scars were invisible. Millions of Americans returned home changed. Some carried physical wounds, others carried memories they would never escape. Entire generations were shaped by the experience of constant death and uncertainty. The war did not end when the fighting stopped. It followed people into their life. When the final surrender came, it was quiet. No dramatic conclusion matched the scale of destruction that preceded it. There was relief, but little celebration. The cost was too high. Too many names had been added to casualty lists. Too many families were missing someone who would never return. America emerged from the Civil War transformed. The old nation, loosely connected and deeply divided, no longer existed. In its place stood a more centralized, more industrial, and more powerful country. The relationship between the government and its citizens had fundamentally changed. War had accelerated processes that might otherwise have taken decades. But unity came at a price. The memory of the conflict lingered. Regional resentment persisted. The consequences of the war shaped politics, economics, and identity long after the guns fell silent. The Civil War was not just a chapter in American history. It was a turning point in how modern wars would be fought and understood. It revealed the true cost of internal conflict and demonstrated that once total war begins, nothing remains untouched. What America gained in strength, it paid for in blood. And the lessons learned would echo far beyond its borders, influencing conflicts yet to come.